What's meant by that, matrilineal?
Essentially, you receive you're acknowledged primarily based on your mother's families and relatives. You inherit based on that. You might receive your name. The family name is primarily based on your mother's family.
So when you get married, the man's name would become the woman's last name?
Yeah, the man could take on the woman's name.
Well,
and the children would take on.
That's virtually unheard of in the West, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what does that suggest? That suggests that the value of females in those cultures
they're terribly
important?
Terribly important and respected. And so you have a case where essentially women were highly respected based on some very concrete positions that they had, rather than saying, well, we deserve to be treated with respect. They were in respectable positions. They were pursuing very prominent careers and so forth, including doctors and pharmacists and so forth. So based on that, there was a lot of room for women to command respect, really.
Now let's talk about politics, the realm of politics. Your argument is that women in African society played a more prominent role, let's say, than perhaps that in politics than we would be accustomed to in the West.
Yes, one of the things that you notice when you're studying women in politics in Africa historically is that the kings are often listed with their mothers, and the office of Queen Mother is a very common office that you'll see in traditional African systems throughout the continent of Africa today and yesterday.
Queen Mother?
Yes, the office of Queen Mother, the Ashanti call it the Ohima. But that office is something that's felt very, very critical to the political structure. The Queen Mother would be responsible for consulting the king in a number of different very critical situations. They would go to the Queen Mother. Of course, the Queen Mother, that is typically the mother of the king, but it may be an elderly aunt or older sister. But it's an office that generally is going to always be filled. And you have to remember, though, even during current times, while Africa is considered a colonized continent, a lot of times there's still the traditional practices in place and traditional political systems in place. And so sometimes people kind of go back and forth.
Now, in the Holy Bible, there's a reference to Ethiopia, and there's a reference to Philip meeting a eunuch who was sent under the authority of Queen Candace.
Yes, Candace, or Kendaki might be her African name. The Candaces.
Was that a name, or was that a title given to a succession of queens?
It was a name, but it is also a title because the Candaces ruled from about the period of about 300 BC through 300 AD. Roughly, and so there were
600 years of women rule,
off and on, but primarily women ruling the region during this time.
And this was documented in the Holy Bible, isn't it?
Yeah,
because Philip was supposed to go meet this guy and be baptized under the authority of this woman.
Right.
But go ahead.
Exactly. And so yes, with the Candaces, they had a variety of names. So when you're trying to do research, it's very critical that you look for these alternative names. But they were referred to as Candace a lot of times after they assumed office or were officially recognized as a royal member of the family. There was a Candace around the 25 BC period that is credited with really halting the domination of the Romans during that time period. So that's very, very significant.
In other words, the Romans were attacking
Egypt in this time period.
And this was, you're talking about the Romans not crossing over the first cataract over into Ethiopia? Because, is that the reference that you're making? That they had conquered Egypt.
Right, about that period, about that same period. They were still going back and forth a lot of times, warring with the Romans during that time period. So She's credited with really holding up holding up the plans of the Romans during that time period. But essentially, yes, the Romans were in power about the 300 BC period.
Okay, because I remember Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, I suspect, in 332 BC or so, wasn't it?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And but the legend had it that he didn't cross over. He was a Greek, of course, and he didn't cross over the first cataract from Egypt into Ethiopia because he didn't want to be he didn't want to risk being defeated by a woman.
Candaces. Yeah, and a lot of times there was actually a king that was actually in power, officially the designated leader, but the Candaces were just so powerful, I should say, that they were recognized and they were feared more than anybody. And a lot of people from the outside weren't aware that there was actually a king in power. They assumed a lot of times that Candace was actually in power.
So in other words, you're saying this was a universal assumption from people outside of Africa to just assume that Africa was, these different places were ruled by women.
Yes.
It was that well known.
Yeah, the Candaces, yes.
That's pretty interesting because we don't tend to think of, when we think of political and military leaders in the West, we might come up with maybe Elizabeth the Great or Elizabeth the First, this kind of thing. But generally, we tend to think of men, don't we?
Yes, and this is very significant because a lot of times in this country, for example, should something happen to our president, you know, there's you have to wait until another male is installed. Where in a lot of traditional African societies, the Queen Mother automatically is the person in power until such time that another king is named, and the Queen Mother often is the person that decides who the next king is going to be. And in some cases, they didn't relinquish their power very quickly. They served for a number of years. And in cases such as Hatshepsut, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, she went a little further and decided that she would declare herself Pharaoh, be acknowledged as such, and was really in power until she was forced to relinquish that power.
Hatshepsut. Okay, but didn't she have to kind of appear to be a man in order to?
Very much so. Any person that assumed power was required to wear the formal regalia that was designed for a man, including a beard sewn with the golden thread. And she wasn't shy about it. She put it all on and went a step further and required individuals to refer to her as Her Majesty the King. And she was one of 5 women known to be declared Pharaoh. And there may be many more, but we know of at least 5 women. Now,
Nefertiti, does she come into that? Nefertiti? We're talking about ancient Egypt now.
Almost Nefertari. She was a queen. She was the royal wife of Ahmose. And no, she was a queen. She was not declared Pharaoh.
Okay. And of course, we know
Nefertari, not to be confused with Nefertiti.
Nefertiti, right? who was the wife of Akhenaten, who was the religious pharaoh.
Yes.
And okay, so all these people are noted throughout ancient Egypt's history. Let's talk about labor, the division of labor, sexual division of labor among men and women in Africa.
In Africa, there's been a long tradition of women traders, particularly in the West. Women tend to dominate trade in those areas. And trade, of course, is very, very essential to the economy, as well as farming. And farming, about 80% of the rural African women are estimated to engage in farming in the African society. So that's very, very significant.
So you're saying that, that women play similar roles in the labor force as does men?
Very much so, and not to mention again the spiritual leaders that were a lot of times that were female.
Okay, but before we talk about spiritualism, I'm just trying to. I want to make a point about this the labor, division of labor.